Can you explain what intentional conversations are and why they're so critical in project management?
For a long time, and even today, we bring project teams together. We often have a kickoff meeting, and one of the things we often talk about is, well, if we're going to succeed in this project, we have to trust each other. And everyone goes, mm-hmm. And then we get to work. And so what's fascinating about that is we all have a different context of what that word trust is. We have different belief systems and values and understandings and experiences and projections and expectations that come with trust.
Effective communication is the foundation of any high-performing team, especially in the complex world of AEC project management. When teams are made up of individuals with diverse roles, responsibilities, and backgrounds, a shared understanding becomes essential for project success. Without it, your projects can lose focus, team connections will break down, and project outcomes can suffer. In this episode, I'm excited to welcome Kyle Majchrowski, author of Powerful Conversations, How to Talk About What Matters Most in Work and Life. Kyle's going to talk about how intentional conversations can transform team dynamics, foster trust and innovation, and put people at the center of every successful project. I'm your host, Anthony Pisano, and this is the AEC Project Management Podcast. Let's dive in. Now I'd like to welcome our guest onto the show for today. Kyle Majchrowski is a senior project executive at Banner Health, board president of NexIntent, and founder of NexIntent. Kyle, welcome to the AEC Project Management Podcast.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
So, Kyle, maybe you can start us off by telling our listeners a little bit about yourself and what led you to focus so deeply on connection in project delivery.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've been in this industry for a long time. I've been on the owner's side for going on 20 years. I started as a subcontractor way back early in the day, but moved quickly to the development side. And so I worked in development for a while and then moved to an academic medical center where I had the privilege of leading a development and construction group for the entire organization. And then to where I am now at Banner Health, where I oversee capital planning, delivery, as well as operations and facilities management through 5 different states at 12 facilities. And so long journey, and about halfway through that journey, it kind of hit me, mostly my staff. I had a wonderful team who kind of grabbed me and shook me violently and said, "Hey, do you realize there's people here?" And I went, "I'm not quite sure what that means." I've always been really process orientated. And so I can remember that day, that exact conversation when it kind of shook me and violently shook me into the realm of, hey, there's people who do this, so let's spend some time on that. And lo and behold, that has taken me on a decade-long journey.
Yeah, that's interesting. I always tell people that, one of the biggest kind of misnomers about project management is that it excludes the word people from the phrase, right? So people think of project management, managing tasks, scoping, scheduling, budgeting, and they kind of leave out something that's kind of important, which is people, right? And your stakeholders and everyone that you have to interact with along the way, which just, again, I think puts project managers or new project managers in the mindset of, okay, if I can manage my scope, schedule, and budget, I'll be fine. Yeah, but the problem with that is you're not going to do that unless you can really interact well with people. And obviously that's kind of what we're going to dive into today. So, Kyle, you've emphasized the importance of intentional conversations in both work and life. Can you explain what intentional conversations are and why they're so critical in project management?
Sure. I'll give you an example to help explain it. So for a long time, and even today, we bring project teams together. We often have a kickoff meeting, and one of the things we often talk about is, well, if we're going to succeed in this project, we have to trust each other. And everyone goes, mm-hmm. And then we get to work. And so what's fascinating about that is we all have a different context of what that word trust is. We have different belief systems and values and understandings and experiences and projections and expectations that come with trust. And we often skate right past it because we all think it's a good thing to say. We should all trust each other. And of course, no one's going to say, no, we will succeed by not trusting each other. No, people are going to say we should trust. But then you have to take the next couple steps and actually explore it with the people in the room. So, what does that mean? How are we going to trust each other? Where is it coming from? What is it rooted in? How are we going to behave when other people come on? What are we going to do with them in order to get them to understand how we either extend or withhold trust? So this is one example, but we have to spend time talking about who we are, who's on the team, how we see the world, how we interact with each other, how we behave before we actually get into the work.
So it's like digging deeper than just the surface conversations.
Absolutely. Because it's really easy. I mean, authenticity is another great one. Be authentic. Well, depending where you are, you should be more or less authentic. Well, that can be really confusing. That can also change the dynamic of people real quick.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. All right, so let's dig a little deeper here. So in your book, Powerful Conversations: How to Talk About What Matters Most in Work and Life, you explore tools for meaningful dialogue. Can you share a key strategy or a takeaway from the book that AEC professionals can apply in their professional lives?
Yeah, I would say selfless plug, pick it up and follow the instructions. No, the what the book does is it takes you through 21 different topics. Trust is one of those, and it actually encourages you and gives you questions to have a very intentional conversation. So let's keep going with the trust thing. So the first is if you're talking to somebody else, or you have a core group, or you have a small leadership team, first we have to figure out what trust is. Well, we start with a handful of questions that are somewhat surface level, but get the dialogue going. What is trust? Can you define it? That kind of thing. And then you go through the next set of questions, which takes you a step deeper. And then finally, a third step deeper. And so they can become, I would say, uncomfortable. That's true, but it's kind of a hard word. They can become pushy. They can become very self-exploratory, but it's a guide. It truly is a guide. And so when you say, well, let's talk about trust, or let's talk about compassion or empathy or things like those, it can be unless you have an expert in the room, it can be a really weird and awkward conversation. Some groups will naturally, and they'll be like, ooh, they'll pull out their phones, they'll start doing research, they'll talk about it, and they'll engage that way. For others, you just kind of sit there and look at each other and go, how do we do this? This is kind of strange. So it's willing to go, okay, let's go on this journey together. That's probably the best advice I could give, is be open about what I know, what I believe, and what I think about whatever it is we're going to explore together may or may not be exactly the way or the right way. So let's spend some time together doing that.
Yeah, I really like that. And what I like about kind of your philosophy and the frameworks that you provide is that, especially for technical professionals, which most of our listeners are by background, when you're talking about emotional things, having trust, conversations around trust and deeper conversations, it can definitely be daunting. I mean, it's definitely outside of, I would say, most people's comfort zones, but I feel like you give a process or a framework with the questions at least to help guide someone through it. Because I know me as an engineer, and you said earlier yourself, you're process oriented. We want a process, we want steps to be able to follow to navigate some of these tricky situations. And I think if you have something like that as a project manager, when you're trying to wade through these conversations on your projects, it can make it a lot easier to navigate than if you're just like, okay, what do I do next? This is not my specialty, having these difficult types of conversations. So I think the framework can be extremely helpful for, analytical, you know, professionals, quite frankly.
Yep, exactly. And there many of us in our industry, we like to process. Most of us don't like to be put on the spot and forced to make sudden decisions. And even when we do, we'll quietly reserve the right to change our mind after we've had some time to think about it. And we often do. And there's nothing wrong with that. And so one of the things I encourage is don't do it all in one setting. If you're going to sit down and actually try to learn who's around you and spend some time understanding you and the people around you, give yourself some grace and do that over time. If you want to process, do 15 minutes on Monday, 15 on Wednesday, 15 on Friday, or something like that. Turn it into like you're practicing an instrument. You can't learn an instrument in an 8-hour seminar. You have to do a little bit each
Right.
day and keep going. And so, allow yourself to have that pacing and don't rush it. Let it evolve and let people process the conversations as you dive into these things a little bit each time.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think kind of what some of your frameworks and your questions remind me of is I've done a lot of like researching, leadership wise on some of these great athletic coaches that have had a lot of success in team building and team communication. I think it might have been Bill Walsh from his book that I read where he talked about like, if I had a situation in the fourth quarter, like on a play that was third and long and we messed it up, I'd go back and like the next game I would have like 5 or 6 plays I wanted to run if it was late in the third quarter and we were losing by a certain amount. So it's kind of like if I get into a conversation about trust, I have a framework of questions I can pull from so that next time I'm not sitting there and I don't know where to go next. And I think we need things like that in project management because it's high pressure, right? You could be on a job site, you could be on a public meeting, and if something comes up, you want to have like a toolkit of some things, whether it's in your brain or whether you have something in front of you, quite frankly, that can help you navigate those situations. And again, I think it goes back a little bit to what you just said, is it also would allow you to prepare better because you can kind of read through some different scenarios, some different questions I can ask, some different directions I can go to kind of better equip you. So I know for me as a PM, whenever I can have tools like that available, going into a kickoff meeting or going into a site meeting, it just makes my life a lot easier because I don't have to think as much when I'm out there because it's usually pretty fast paced. So I think that that's a big benefit. So Kyle, you often speak about making people the center of any project. How can project leaders foster trust, vulnerability, and even innovation in today's world within their teams? Because that's important in where we're at today.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I see it all the time. Um how you make people the center, it's so much easier to make tools and processes the center. So much easier. And so when you really spend some time trying to understand yourself, and that's where it starts. You got to look on, as a good friend of mine put, you got to look at your side of the fence. You got to understand who you are. You have to understand how you process. You got to understand how you communicate, understand how you feel, which I know some of us don't necessarily enjoy feelings, but they're important. They're a part of all of us and who we are. And so, when you deliver quote unquote bad news, you have to be respectful. If someone's going to get excited and there's a lot of drama that comes with it, obviously it's emotional. That's an okay thing. As long as they don't take it out on people, people are still going to go through the process of experiencing emotion. I mean, all of us in the project delivery world, when we get bad news or we get news that doesn't follow our plan, or when we find out that people are changing or people are switching out or some companies falling down or supply chains out of whack, we don't necessarily immediately go to calculate what we do next. Most of
Right.
us feel something at that moment. And it's understanding that that's okay. And what other people feel it too. And sometimes it's just a matter of, you know, I've seen it before where a group comes together and they get a really difficult challenge gets thrown in front of them unexpectedly. And they just kind of sit there and someone finally speaks up and goes, damn, this sucks. And they all just kind of exhale and go, yeah, it really does. And then a couple minutes later, it's like, all right, now what do we do? But literally, just having that moment of awareness of the people around you, like they need a moment to breathe. They don't need a moment, they don't need the steps. They don't need just recognizing that, hey, it's almost like I have a great project manager that I've worked with for years, and he is all about consistency, getting it done, responsibilities high on his list. When decisions are not made in time, he gets irritated. When changes are made at the 11th hour, he gets really frustrated. And so he has to make sure that he understands if there's anybody on the team that's likely to bring ideas forward late in the game, it's not because they're doing it to mess with him. They're not trying to cause the project to fail. And they're certainly not doing it because they realized it 6 months ago, but decided to sit on it because they knew this would be fun. They had an idea and they wanted to get permission from the team to see if they should explore it. And so he's had to catch himself. And it's not because he needs to change who he is. He's still going to get irritated that someone wants to change course at the last minute. That's fine. That's who he is. Now, how the people around him experience that, that's the important part. That choice between your heart and your mouth, what goes on inside of you and what comes out. That is where you can go from good to great.
Yeah, no, that's really well said. And I think the one thing you said that can emphasize that earlier, you said, you got to, understand your side of the fence, right? You got to understand your habits, your tendencies, your responses, because that's going to help you. I guess you kind of have that gap of when someone says something to you and then you respond, right? Like if you can kind of slow that down a little bit, like you're saying, and like get plugged into what you're feeling, but not necessarily verbally communicate it instantly or think about the best way to communicate it. I definitely think that that's something that everyone probably can work on and improve on, but it's especially important for project managers because we're in these situations where we have to think quickly, think on our toes, but also what we say is very important. And I also think that what you said also about, we have to deliver bad news and we have to do it relatively quickly because that is project management in a nutshell. And most of our clients, when we ask them, what makes for great project managers, they'll say like they give us the bad news quickly so we could deal with it and adjust on the fly. And so I think definitely you do need to be able to respond fast, but you also need to cater that response, not just blurt out everything you're feeling, because that may not get you the best result as a PM. It most likely won't, especially the example that you gave. And that's something that I think it's really one of those things that would be, I would think, a high leverage thing to focus on because your interactions with your clients and with other stakeholders on your projects really drive the success of the project. And so it's going to be worth your time and effort to put in there, which I know is difficult for people to do, but hopefully, you can use some of these tips to do that.
No, it's really important. I get really frustrated from time to time on social media where people oversimplify some of these things. Transparency is one of those ones that keeps getting thrown out. Oh, we just got to be transparent. Just got to be transparent. Well, I think we've all seen it where I, I I remember loud and clear. There's a story where a superintendent, you're going around with the client, the PM, the supers on there. Everyone's talking about their concerns. We're like 3 weeks or 3 weeks to go live, and everyone's asking what's going on, and people are feeling confident. And here's the question: so the superintendent has this list of things that still can go wrong in the next 3 weeks. Are you transparent and share that entire list with that audience or not?
Hmm.
And if you make it really simple, well, of course, the stuff you see on Facebook and LinkedIn and everything else, of course, transparency is the key to vulnerability and trust and blah, blah, blah. Well, this guy happened to choose, I'm going to share. So he shared. And of course, the client rep ran back to the client group and said, oh my God, we're at risk. We're never going to, all these things can happen. And I couldn't get a good feel about what they're doing about it. And so they spun out of control because he made a choice to suddenly share all of the risk that he saw that could still happen. And of course, very little came true.
Right.
But it was one of those situations where, okay, what's the right thing for the group at this moment? And 100% transparency was absolutely not the right thing. Does that
Right.
mean that you should intentionally withhold stuff? Sometimes, yes, absolutely. But again, it comes down to knowing where you are and the people around you. If you know, and there's a lot of people that could have said, hey, if you give even one hint that something could go wrong, let's talk about it with a smaller group before we go to this larger audience, because we can still bring that forward and say there's a risk. However, here's the 19 things we're doing to prevent it. And if it does happen, here's what's going to happen and here's how it's going to play out. That confidence changes dramatically. But again, you have to know your audience and you have to know how you're delivering the message and who you're delivering it with.
Yeah, absolutely. And being kind of keyed into that is important. And just one kind of aside, but related to that we talk a lot about when we do our PM training is having a good lessons learned process at the end of your project. So in the example Kyle just gave, you know, it didn't go well because of all the risks that were kind of brought to the table. Next, in the lessons learned, you could go through kind of a question process and say, maybe next time we can meet with a smaller group of people, kind of go over the risks, identify the impact of those risks and the probability, and maybe not necessarily share these lower probability risks because it's really, doesn't make a lot of sense to share. So that's something that could definitely be done. So Kyle, peopling is a unique term that you use to describe your approach. Can you kind of explain what it means and why it's important for successful project delivery?
Yeah, that's so that I've heard human skills, which also I think again makes me laugh as well. When you so I had the pleasure of being involved in a study up in the state of Washington where they built the same laboratory building from the ground up in an 8-month period, design and built. And then they did it again and one more time. So they built the same building 3 times, 3 different locations. And they used the same team each time. And the first one, what they challenged the team with was, we've built this before. We would like to hit a certain cost point. We'd like to hit a certain time frame. And they went, okay, great. And so they initially thought that it was unachievable. Well, they had enough, I don't know, say excitement, energy, whatever you call it. They had enough that they were able to hit the target of both cost and schedule with great accuracy, which was pretty cool. And they were very proud. So of course the owner said, great, let's go do it again. And let's see if you can reduce even further. Well, your first step, you can find a lot of gains in efficiency. So they were feeling pretty cocky and pretty confident that we could do this again. Well, they hit it the same time and the same budget on the second one. And you would think, well, with all that experience and so forth, how could you make it the same? Well, the same was great for the first one. So the second one also was, okay, this is good. Client was very happy. So they said, let's do it one more time. The third one actually took longer and cost more. And part of the reason is because they didn't change the team at all. And so you look at the confidence, the cockiness, we got this, the energy, the ambition, the attitude to try to win. Go back to your sports analogy. How many teams win the championship 2 years in a row with the exact same players?
Yeah.
Not a single one. Not a single one. And so you have to find ways. The goals change, our experiences change, things change about us as people. Time passes, life happens. And so if we don't take a moment to figure out who's on the team, what they're bringing, why they're here, all those different things we talked about earlier, then you run the risk of focusing back on the process, focusing back on the goals, and then spending all of our time trying to hit those and not spending time on who's in the room and what work do we need to align with them based on who's in the room, not what title they have.
Yeah, it's a really good point. In fact, I'm reading a book right now, The Book of Joe, which is about Joe Madden, who was the manager of the Cubs when they won their first World Series in like 100 years. And he said, they were talking about this like level of complacency after you win a championship, right? Just like inherently, like, hey, we just won, like they're on a high and then they're coming down. So, and you start the season and you're like, we won already last year. So you start slow and it makes it very difficult to catch up and then get back to where you were initially. So it's interesting in that if you have a successful project, what is it going to take to do it again, right? It's not maybe as easy as people think, oh, you did it once, you could do it again, because there's all kinds of things that you have to consider, especially the people on the team, like you suggest, and really focusing on that. So that is something that's really interesting to think about in project delivery. So, Kyle, recruitment, engagement, and retention are challenges that pretty much all organizations are facing today, especially in the AEC industry. What advice or tools would you recommend for leaders to address these areas effectively?
It's no different than the project management stuff. You have to know yourself and you have to know your people. So when I say know your people, it's more than, what kind of pizza do you like and what kind of, what kids do you have? What do you do on the weekends? It's truly how do you align the work that's needed to be done with the people in the room? So if I sat through a project, this is fantastic. We're going around the table and we're talking about the stuff that really turns you on and the stuff that drives you nuts. And you get to the superintendent. Got a lot of superintendent stories. They're some of my favorite people in this whole industry. So I get to this guy, it's a hospital project, and he says, it's coming up soon. I got to go do the punch list over on this floor, on this wing. And it just drives me nuts. So I asked him, what drives you nuts about it? And he said, well, I got to go through and I got to take pictures and I got to write all this stuff down and I got to send all these emails and I got to talk to all these people and I got to chase them around and, checklists and da-da-da. And it's just a part of the job that I just don't like. So the next person sitting next to him, I kid you not, is the project engineer, young guy. And I say, okay, so what do you like about the job? He goes, I really love the punch list. And I said, well, why is that? Well, I love going around and making lists and taking pictures and emailing all these people and basically everything the superintendent said. So, of course, I'm sitting there going, do you see the obvious here? And I go, Mr. Superintendent, why are you not giving the punch list to this guy? And he goes, because it's my responsibility. It's what I'm supposed to do. And I'm like, okay, so that right there is a perfect example where we get stuck in our job descriptions and we're not understanding who's in the room. If there's someone who's got that kind of fire to do the job that's supposed to be somebody else's job, but they don't really want to do it, and you align that work with the people who really, really get excited about that work, that's where the magic happens. But how would you ever know that if you didn't ask that question? No one ever stands up and says in the morning, "Oh, hey, by the way, I love punch lists." I mean, that's the most silly, goofy thing you could possibly think of. And hopefully someone might pick up on it along the way. But when we have the intentional conversation about what do we like to do, what do we not like to do, then all of a sudden you can start finding ways to figure out how do we align work with who's in the room.
Yeah, that's really interesting. In fact, one of our previous episodes, we talked a lot about this, specifically about aligning kind of behaviors to your actual project process. Like, not just taking a template and saying, here's a template, go and do it, but really thinking about your team members and their skills and their behaviors, and maybe making sure your process fits that better, right? Because I think it'll kind of help to avoid the situation that you said, or at least give people the forum to say, okay, before we jump in here and run through all the process groups on this project, why don't we think about who does what best, who can talk to the client, things like that. So I do think that's definitely something for everyone out there to consider, is take a good inventory of the skill sets of your team members and some of their past experiences ahead of the project, so you can think about putting them in the right positions to succeed. um, again, some of this stuff you may think sounds obvious, but when you get into these projects and you just start moving and you follow the process and you check the box and you follow the templates, this stuff kind of goes right out the window. So it's definitely something to think about. So, Kyle, before I ask you our final PM pitfalls question, is there any final advice that you would share with AEC professionals that are looking to improve their connections and their conversations, both at work and at home?
I would, let's go one step further on this. Look on your side of the fence. I mean, there's a lot of assessments out there. There's all kinds, from Hogan to DISC to Clifton Strengths, Myers Briggs. I would highly recommend that if anyone hasn't taken one of those, or if they have taken one and they haven't looked at that in a while, go do that. That is one of the best ways to look in the mirror at yourself to figure out who am I and what am I bringing? How am I showing up? And how are other people experiencing me? When you really take a good look at yourself and really understand. And if you're pretty positive that you know yourself, take one of those assessments and give it to somebody who knows you and go, "Hey, what do you think?" And they will give you some kind of some really honest, straightforward feedback about where you really excel and are a rock star and where you're not so good. Because sometimes those blind spots are really hard to see, but those assessments can really help bring some of that to light, especially when you share the results with somebody you know and someone who knows you.
Yeah, I mean that's great advice. In fact, there's kind of a side story on that is we use one of the assessments we use at E&I is this Harrison assessment, and we built like an AEC PM behaviors competency of it that we give ahead of our PM programs. And in one of our programs, we gave it, and we did kind of a group debrief in the beginning. And the feedback that we got was exactly what you just said. People said there were some blind spots that I totally wasn't aware of that this removed for me, and now I'm able to engage a lot better because I understand my blind side. I can work on them and kind of work around them or work on them as I need to. And so I think it's a great thing to do. Number one, just in general with your project managers or with your professionals in your organization. But especially if you're doing like a development program, what we found is do that first. Because then when you go through the development program, they can focus individually on their blind spots and not just go through the program and say, hey, let me take this session 1, session 2, session 3. They can kind of tie it back to their personal strengths and weaknesses. And I think that just totally increases the ROI for all parties involved, from the participants to the company, that's investing in the training. And I think to your point, it does remove some of those blind spots that they have going into their projects and going into their relationships with these stakeholders. And it can really be helpful. And at home, I mean, you have the same, your conversational skills you're using everywhere. So anything that you can find out to help with them is going to make your job easier.
Absolutely. My wife has taken plenty. We've talked through many of them. My oldest son, teenager, has taken some of them, and we've talked through some of them as he's gone through his own self journey to learn about himself and how he shows up and how he's trying to formulate, his. Hopefully, we did a good job, but as we go through that, it's not just for work. I'll say that. It's certainly not just for work.
Yeah, no, for sure. There's no doubt about that. Yeah, and I know, and we say that all the time. It's like, the way you communicate your work styles, they're there from like the time you wake up to the time you go to bed. They don't like switch off when you go home. So it's really valuable to think about these things. All right, Kyle. So my last question for you, we call our PM pitfalls question. What would you say is the biggest project management pitfall that you've seen in the projects you've worked on? And what would you recommend in terms of overcoming it or avoiding it or limiting it for PMs out there listening?
There's a lot of things that come to mind having so many projects under the belt in so many different capacities. I would say the one thing that really bubbles to the surface is, and I've heard this from so many of our service providers, is when the client projects a project as just a project. It's just a floor. It's just an air handler. It's just an office building. What happens, which is really fascinating, is how much the words matter when you communicate that it's a simple project. I don't think there's anything in our world that's simple, but we immediately start making assumptions based on experience of what that truly is. So both as a client who's projecting out and soliciting service from folks, be very conscious not to accidentally oversimplify a project. And on the receiving end, as a service provider, for anyone who's coming in and delivering a portion or a component or being a part of the project team, if you get the impression that it is being oversimplified, by all means, raise your hand as quickly as possible and go, are we sure this is just a... And that has become such I would say a free pass, but it's been a way to get so many folks to engage by giving them the permission to ask the question and go, are we accidentally oversimplifying something that we should not oversimplify just yet?
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think that's a big part of what we try to teach project managers early on in the projects, like when they're scoping it out. Like, if you think that like the client is just, sometimes you have to educate the client, right? Because they think it's just and it's not, and they don't understand what goes into all of that. And so kind of asking questions, doing your fact finding, doing your scoping appropriately can really help with that, because it happens all the time. And listen, part of it is the client just not understanding what goes into it. And part of it is them wanting to just breeze through a project, right? And get it done as cheap and as quick as possible. But definitely something to be aware of for sure. So, well, I want to thank Kyle Majchrowski for coming on the AEC Project Management Podcast. He's authored the book, Powerful Conversations, How to Talk About What Matters Most in Work and Life. We're going to link to his website, his company website, the book site, and his LinkedIn profile as well in the episode show notes here, so you can connect with Kyle, check out the book and everything that he has to offer. Kyle, I want to thank you so much for just spending some time with us here on the podcast. We really do appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Kyle. I can tell you the information he offered up is gold when it comes to project management. We need to be able to interact with people and have those conversations to help us move our projects and our teams forward. If you enjoyed our conversation, please subscribe to our channel here. We put out videos like this on a weekly basis to help engineers become better project managers and leaders. I'll see you next week.